Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. I don't know what city you would pick in the world as the best example of evil and decadence. I suppose there was a time Sodom and Gomorrah would have occupied that position back in Old Testament times. I'm not going to pick a modern city out to do that. But if you picked a city out in Paul's day that was sort of the epitome of decadence, it might have been the city of Corinth. It's set on an isthmus, a narrow band of land that connected a peninsula with modern Greece. And ships that were moving through that area had the choice of going around the peninsula, in which case there tended to be a lot of storms, or somehow going across that isthmus. Today, and there was eventually a channel cut in there, but it wasn't there at Paul's day. Instead, what they did was they would run the ships up to the isthmus. There was a paved area all the way across that isthmus, about a mile. It was only about a mile strip of land, and they had paved that. And then they would either offload the ship on this side, slaves would, and slaves would then take the goods and transport it across that 1 mile isthmus and put it in a ship on the other side to continue the journey. Or in the case of some smaller ships, they'd put the ship itself on rollers and roll that ship all across that isthmus and drop it in the water on the other side, loaded down with goods. This was all done by slave labor, so there were a tremendous number of slaves in the city of Corinth. But what this also meant for Corinth is that while all this was happening, the sailors themselves would go into town. And so Corinth was a necessary stop for many, many sailors. Apparently sailors in that day and age were not particularly well behaved. And Corinth had a reputation for depravity and decadence. There's almost a mountain right on the edge of town called Acrocorinth, and on top of that mountain you can still today see the ruins of a temple that was up there, a pagan temple. About 2,000 cult prostitutes worked out of that temple on the top of that hill overlooking Corinth, and I'm guessing a whole lot of sailors made their way up to the top of that mountain, as well as some citizens. Temple prostitution, religious prostitution, was a way of life at that time because much of the issue was with regard to fertility, and the pagans believed that gods mimicked what human beings did, and if the gods looked down and saw human beings have sex, they would have sex, and that caused the fertility in the world. Certainly a manipulative kind of religion, very contrary to Christianity, even though some Christians think you manipulate God. You don't. God acts, you respond. You don't act, and he responds. But so this manipulative religion is there in the middle of Corinth, but with it comes this temple prostitution, and I imagine a lot of the guys were visiting the temple prostitutes, not so much for religious reasons as for human sex drives. The term even, there was a term in the area, if you called somebody a Corinthian girl, you were basically calling her a streetwalker. That was a derogatory term toward a female if you called her a Corinthian girl. This is the city of Corinth. This is the city to which Paul brings the gospel. Spent some time there, set up his tent-making business in Corinth, and had spent a great deal of time there. But if you might get an idea that Corinth is going to be a problem. Well, the Corinthian church is a problem, and on one level, we can be thankful to God that it was. Because it was, we have 2 letters to this church that help us understand Christianity and the playing out of our religion in our daily lives and in our worship much better than if we didn't have these 2 letters. The 2 letters are 2 out of 4 that Paul wrote to Corinth, evidently. 1 Corinthians talks about a previous letter, and then 2 Corinthians talks about an angry letter. I don't think 1 Corinthians is the angry letter, so that means there was a letter first, and then 1 Corinthians is actually the second letter, and then there was a third letter, the angry one, and then there is a fourth letter, which we know as 2 Corinthians. We don't have the first and third letters. We have the second and fourth letters, which, just to confuse us, we've numbered first and second. But the letter does address a number of concerns. 1 Corinthians still has a I thank God for you in it. 2 Corinthians won't. 1 Corinthians does. But it also addresses several problems that Paul has heard about. And the first problem is in chapter 1, verse 10 and following, and it's cliques. In verse 11, it's been reported to me by Chloe's people, that may be one clique, I don't know, that there is quarreling among you, my brethren. What I mean is that each one of you says, I belong to Paul, that's one clique. I belong to Apollos, that's another clique. I belong to Cephas or Peter, that's another clique. Or I belong to Christ, that may be another clique. Paul's argument is there's not cliques in Christianity. There's not little groups in Christianity. You all belong to Jesus Christ. The second problem that he addresses is in chapter 5, problem number 2, and it's incest, sort of incest. A man is living with his father's wife. Now, we're not told if the father is dead or not. I'm guessing not. The father's wife is probably actually the man's stepson, so I'm not sure technically if you classify that as incest or not. But in any case, it's an immorality that Paul says, you guys need to deal with this. You need to deal with this open sin in your midst, and you need to call this guy to account. The next problem, verse 6, is that they're running to court against each other all the time, these Christians. And Paul says, you're taking this stuff to a pagan court. Isn't there somebody smart enough among you to decide these things? Why do you have to drag this to a pagan court? So problem number 3 is in chapter 6, and it's the lawsuits. Problem number 4 is immorality, and this is probably wrapped up in with the worship and the cult prostitutes and all that. The idea of frequenting a prostitute comes in chapter 6, verses 12 through 20. And so Paul addresses that problem. He says, no, when you join yourself to a prostitute, you join your body to her, and your body's a temple of God. You don't want to do that. You're united with a prostitute instead of being united with your Lord. And probably the issue he's addressing is probably not just sort of the common hooker on the street, although that's certainly a problem too, but more the cult prostitute thing that probably was very popular in Corinth. Then he addresses some questions that apparently they wrote him in a letter, and he begins to answer the questions. The first one is on marriage and celibacy, and apparently the question was something like, in view of everything you've told us and written, Paul, would it be better if we just didn't marry? And Paul's answer is, yeah, probably. But if you are married, don't get divorced. And it's better to marry than burn with lust. That's not how I did my vows. I think, honey, I'd rather marry you than burn with lust. That wasn't part of my vows, but that's kind of, and he recognizes his role. He recognizes the times. I think Paul recognizes the persecutions and the difficulties that are coming, and is saying, in view of the circumstances, yeah, it's probably better if you didn't have a lot of attachments in view of what's coming your way. But he's not against marriage either. The next question that comes up is in chapter 8, and it's the second answer to question. And the question apparently is, okay, we live in this city, and everywhere there are banquets, there are meals, there's food served, and almost all of it's been offered to idols, the meat. So is it okay to eat the meat offered to idols? And Paul's answer is kind of an interesting one. He says it depends. Depends on how it impacts your brother. If it causes him to stumble, if it causes him a problem for you to do that, don't do it. I remember my dad as a kid, and I thought he was kind of crazy for doing this, but now I really respect him for it. He would sometimes, he and Mom would split a beer after he mowed the lawn or something. Dad did not drink very much, but he might have half a beer after he mowed the lawn, but he wouldn't drink it in the backyard. And he wouldn't drink it in the backyard because our neighbors believed that drinking was wrong. And I thought, well, Dad, that's their problem, not your problem. But Dad did not want to cause them to stumble. He didn't want to give offense, so he'd drink that beer in the house. He would never take a beer out in the yard. Paul's kind of saying that kind of thing. If it causes your brother a problem, don't do it. At the same time, he says, don't ask if it's been offered to idols. If you don't know, just eat it. It's not that the idol is anything. The bigger issue is, what does it say to people around you? What's the witness that it gives? That's probably a question we all ought to ask about our lives and decisions we make. We're free to make a lot of decisions, but they're not all beneficial decisions. They're not all positive decisions that help our witness. And that's probably one of the questions we ought to ask ourselves as we make decisions in our life too. That's quite a lengthy discussion on that food offered to idols. It goes all the way through up to the beginning of chapter 11. And then the next question seems to be of the worship life, and it's several questions about the worship life, about women's head uncovered, that kind of thing. And also there's a whole, then it follows that with another question about the Lord's Supper. And apparently the way they were eating the Lord's Supper was different than the way we do today. Apparently it was part of a meal, because the way that Paul describes it sounds like it's more part of a meal. Answer number 5 to the question that they ask is in chapter 12, and that's that famous section about spiritual gifts. Chapter 12, 13, and 14 all deal with the issue of spiritual gifts and how these play out in the church life. And Paul acknowledges a variety of gifts, including speaking in tongues, including some of the more miraculous gifts, but he also talks about how those are used in the church. And if nobody can understand what you say, what good is it to say it in the church? And he focuses on the tongue speaking as more a personal kind of situation than a churchly arrangement. Chapter 15 is a beautiful chapter on the resurrection, and I think the question probably was, is there really a resurrection? Are we waiting for a resurrection? And Paul makes the point that Christ is raised, you'll be raised. And if one isn't true, the other isn't true, and we're all dependent on that resurrection of Christ. The book closes with some greetings from Paul to the people in Asia and from some of those that are with him. Interesting line in verse 21 of chapter 16. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Apparently the rest of the book was not written by his own hand. It was dictated to a secretary, and that last part represents his signature on that book. Wonderful book for understanding Christian life together, for taking on some of the challenging issues that challenge us today too in our daily walk with our Lord Jesus Christ, and how that plays out in our life as a Christian church and how it plays out in our lives as Christians in the world. I am actually kind of glad that Corinth was a pretty messed up city, because a result of that is 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which tell us a lot about God and his will for our lives.